Hello and welcome to this video, which is about how I made a set of Corset Busk strips for use in corset mock-ups. Inserting a busk into a corset takes time, and you don't necessarily want to do that for every corset mock-up. Using strips like these, you can very quickly pop them on, take them off, and use them again and again. So let's get to it.
For this project, I used a metal split busk, 4 strips of strong non-stretch fabric, a small herringbone coutil, thread, bias binding. You could also overlock the edges if you prefer. I used a sewing machine and a regular sewing foot, as well as a zipper foot, a ruler or 2, a tapered awl, pins, and I used a piece of synthetic whalebone. You could also use a cable tie, but it must be long enough to thread through all the loops in the busk. And a way to mark my fabric. I also used an iron and an ironing board. I started on the pins side of the busk. I laid 1 strip on top of a second. I pinned them together and used the normal sewing foot and a 1.5mm stitch length to sew a 15mm seam allowance. I pressed the seam towards the facing piece. I top stitched the seam to the facing, which is also called understitching. Then pressed the seam to be right side out. After unfolding the fabric, I placed the pin side of the busk on top of the seam allowance and measured to ensure that it was sitting at an equal distance from each end. I marked the top and the bottom of the busk piece, and at each pin. Then I also measured and marked 6mm across from the seam. Next, I picked up the awl. I started each hole from the inside, at the centre of the cross I had marked. Then switched to pushing the awl from the outside, so that the whole edges go towards the inside. Then came wriggling in the pin. The fabric closes around it, tight and secure, and the process was repeated for each of the other pins. Moving to the loop side, I drew a line 15mm from the edge on my 3rd piece of fabric. I placed the loop side of my busk onto the fabric, lined it up with the pins, and marked the ends. Then I marked above and below each of the loops. I extended these lines and put a cross through each area to ensure I didn't sew where the loops will be. I then used some of these areas to pin the third and fourth piece of fabric together. I then stitched along the 15mm seam line, backstitching to secure when I reached a loop point. Then raising the needle and foot and travelling the work along. I again backstitched at the start of the next stitch and continued on in the same fashion. Once it is stitched, you can see that the thread is continuous and that there is backstitching each side of where the stitching jumps over the loops. This time the seam was pressed open, then the facing side was top stitched, and finally it was pressed right sides out. I inserted the loops through the gaps in the seam Then I threaded a synthetic whalebone through the loops to pull the metal piece through the fabric and hold it taut. With that, I was ready to secure the busk pieces. I changed to the zipper foot, then stitched next to each busk piece to secure it. It's a task that must be done slowly. I focused on holding the busk flat and stitching as close to it as possible. I removed the synthetic whalebone and then had a functioning busk piece. I trimmed down the top and bottom to 12mm and cut silk bias strips to appropriate lengths. I stitched on the first bias strip right sides together with a 10mm seam allowance. I then folded it to the back and pinned. then stitched in a ditch to secure it. I repeated the process for the binding at the bottom of the busk and along the long edge, as well as for the other half of the busk. And so, the busk strips were ready to use. I had also made these lacing strips, which have bones either sides of the grommets. I aligned the edge of the busk strip with the centre front edge of a corset mock-up, and pinned, then stitched using a fairly long 2.5mm stitch and without securing the ends. This was also done for the other strips. When adding the lacing, I didn't go beyond the upper or lower edges of the garment, as that would bend my lacing strips and make them sit strangely. I also didn't lace through every grommet. So here you see me using the busk and lacing strips, fitting my red-threaded 1860s corset, which will have its own video in due course. It's easy to use the same strips for each iteration of the mock-up. I also have a set of busk and lacing strips in a suitable size for underbust corsets. And if you offset the lacing strips, you can use them for spiral lacing, as I did for my stays mock-up.
And here we have it, a removable and reusable busk strip for a corset mock-up. I wish you all the best for your corset mock-up adventures. Please let me know in the comments if you used busk strips like this, or indeed lacing strips, for your mock-ups. Thank you for watching. I hope you join me again next time. Goodbye.